Welcome back to the news, everybody. Thank you for rating and reviewing us on iTunes. Thank you for supporting us at patreon.com/Matt Lewis. Thank you for subscribing to youtube.com/Matt Lewis. And the new news, please pre-order my forthcoming book, Filthy Rich Politicians, if you've not done so already, wherever fine books are sold. I'm happy to welcome back to the show I think probably the favorite guest on the show, our friend David Frum. He's a staff writer at The Atlantic. He's the author of Trumpocalypse. David Frum, welcome back to the news.
Such a pleasure.
Let's start in the world of politics and kind of the horse race-ish politics, I guess. It's also a legal story. And I'm talking, of course, about Donald Trump and this case with the Manhattan District Attorney, Alvin Bragg. A lot of things we could talk about, but let me start with this. Should Alvin Bragg be pursuing this particular prosecution?
I think we need to take a step back before we ask that question and pinch ourselves and remind ourselves that almost everything we know about this case comes from Donald Trump and his friends. And that is not a reliable source of information. So there have been many hot takes written. And I'll confess, I wrote one, I just didn't happen to publish it because at the last minute, I thought, what do I really know about this matter? And how do I know it? And I don't trust it. So maybe I should not be expressing this view. That the assumption is pervasive that Bragg is about to indict Donald Trump on basically the same theory that John Edwards was indicted by a federal prosecutor half a decade ago. But that's only think that because
that would be somehow misappropriating funds or using campaign funds to pay, in this case, hush money and not reporting it. So in a way, it feels like weak tea because it's actually like a white collar.
In this case, the funds were not campaign funds; they were business funds, and so the theory is, the claim is being made, this would be a business fraud case, but you don't know any of that. You don't, in fact, know any of that. You think you know it because of stuff that comes from the Trump camp, but let's step back and think. Well, the one thing we do know for the most recent fact is that Bragg summoned David Pecker, the former CEO of National Enquirer, which had a pattern of buying and suppressing stories unfavorable to Donald Trump and other friends of that company. And so the question is, is Donald Trump the target? Is maybe the National Enquirer the target? Do we have larger patterns of tax fraud going on here? Remember, the Trump organization has already been indicted and convicted of criminal tax fraud. And in their summation to the jury, the New York state prosecutors said every one of these frauds was signed off on by Donald Trump. And so it's very possible that the case they're bringing is a larger tax fraud case in which the payoff to Stormy Daniels was one of many frauds. I'm not suggesting I don't know. I just think we all ought to cool it. And be very wary of building speculative arguments on information that comes from the Trump camp because they are liars.
Yeah. Well, we saw what happened with the Mueller case, right? Where Bill Barr rolls out this memo and totally frames the discussion and the debate for weeks before the actual Mueller report is released. And that really worked from a PR standpoint, and definitely possible Trump is playing a similar game here.
Yes. And by the way, I think I read somewhere that he raised something like $1.5 million in the week after his tweet. So just understand his game and don't allow yourself to be played by his game.
My latest piece at the Daily Beast is about how Donald Trump has been spurring violence again, or at least violent rhetoric that could spur violence, where he sends out these tweets or truths, whatever you want to call them. There was a picture, I think he deleted it subsequently, of Donald Trump holding a baseball bat next to a picture of Alvin Bragg with his hands up. He also said a lot of very incendiary things. We've been down this road before. Trump's rhetoric has inspired violence. It's inspired violence at rallies. It's inspired violence on January 6th. It even inspired violence after Mar-a-Lago. Is there anything new to say, or is this just Donald Trump is very irresponsible?
ABC News in 2021, I think, had a story where they counted 54 instances of people who had committed violence and either in the course of committing the violence had cited Donald Trump as their reason, or when they were in court, defended themselves by citing Donald Trump. So it's not just that his actions might lead to violence, but in 54 cases they have. And worse is I think is to come, because that's the way Donald Trump has changed between 2024 and 2016. I mean, he's always been an aggrieved person, but in 2015, 2016, he was able to link his grievances to other people's. This time he's doing the opposite. This time the message is his grievances, and he's trying to mobilize other people's grievances to support his
Definitely.
own.
And he's really hitting that thing, David, about like, they're not coming for me.
Yeah.
I'm just in the way. They're coming for you. I'm just standing in the way. I mean, that has become not just something he says occasionally, but a central theme of his. And that's very dangerous.
Yes. And there was just another one of these horrific gun massacres, this time in Nashville. And I think, there's obviously an endemic, bubbling, low-level, sub-political violence. I mean, people have. I mean, the ideologies of these killers doesn't neatly overlap with the party political system, but these you do have people who are. And of course, it's the guns and the mental illness together that are the cause. It's the politics is just sort of the framework they give to explain to themselves what they're about to do, although they're driven and enabled by other things. But there is bubbling, endemic, low-level, sub-political violence in the United States, and it would not be so difficult to upgrade that sub-political violence into truly political violence.
Absolutely. I mean, I think in Nashville, it was a Christian school. It was a former student who was a biological woman and a trans man. I believe that has been established, but it doesn't really matter, because I think your larger point holds true, which is that there is a environment, a toxic environment of political violence, and people who may be disturbed or vulnerable can get caught up in that, and it can, there are cross currents. It could cut different ways, but as I've heard Jonah Goldberg and I've heard Charlie Sykes make this point recently, you don't need a mob of hundreds or thousands of people to do something super catastrophic. One bad person is all it would take if Trump were to summon their worst angels.
I was at an event of fairly fancy people a little while ago, and I was asked the question, do you think things are worse and more polarized and divided in the United States today than they used to be, or less? And my answer, and I'll repeat it here in a public forum, was I think there have been many periods, including in my lifetime, when American society was more divided than it is today. I think American society was more, obviously between 1965 and 1975, when you had, radical movements of all kinds and protests and counter-protests, obviously the society was more divided than it is today. The difference in 1965, 75, and now was back then, you had a political system that was struggling for unity atop a society that was being riven by truly social fissures. Today we have the opposite. Today we have a society where actually the level of grievance in the society is, I think, not high compared to what it was 65 to 75. But the political system, at this time, instead of being a suppressant factor, is an accelerant factor. And that's not unique. Donald Trump is the worst actor, but there are plenty of others. I mean, just think of all the Congress people who have posed with AR-15 weapons. So even suppose you have a very out there view of gun rights, that I would think that someone who said, I want this weapon for self-defense would say, and that's why the gun is quietly in my home, over the hearth, not bothering anybody. If you don't mess with me, I don't come messing for you. It would not be an aggressive statement. When you put it on your lapel, you're saying, I want a fight. I want a gunfight. I fantasize myself the winner. Although I have to tell people about this, that you don't drive as well as you think you do. Your jokes aren't as funny as you think they are, and you're not as good with a gun as you think you are.
I think that's definitely true. I had an expert, a security expert. I think he's a former FBI agent on the podcast a few years ago. He had a book called Stay Safe, which I would highly recommend to anyone. It even talks about things like school shootings. But he told me that something like 3% in a shooting situation, an active shooter situation, only 3% of bullets actually hit the target.
Yeah.
Um,
My
and so they're missing 97% of the shots
my late
if there's
father-in-law
a moving target.
my late father-in-law was in World War II in Korea. And when he finished up his Korea service in the Canadian Army, he had a very distinguished career. When he came back, his last assignment was as a trainer, as a training officer. I think the Korean War had ended, but they were still taking in troops. And so he was up in Northern Ontario training men. And it was boring because the war was over. So they're on the range, and he's, in his officer's uniform, and the men are blasting at the targets. And suddenly a deer shows up. And out of boredom, he says, $5 to the man who brings down that deer. So this little squad of soldiers all turn their 1953 vintage Korean War rifles at the deer, and they all start blasting, and the deer runs away, safe and sound. So he would tell that story often when trying to explain to people why you are unlikely to achieve with a gun what you think you're likely to achieve.
Yep. Well, the other point I would make, since you mentioned the 1953 rifle, we have had other times in our history where we were very divided and the country was in bad shape, but we didn't have AR-15s and we didn't have Twitter. So the technology, the capacity for someone to spread bad ideas, to divide us, and then to kill us has gotten much more sophisticated with time.
And I would say, personally, we may not have Twitter for very much longer. That problem may be about to be taken care of by the man who's single-handedly wrecking it. But we do have TikTok, and that's something else I know you want to talk about. And TikTok is a very inflammatory medium, probably more inflammatory than TikTok. And I sometimes, when I'm talking to younger people, I hear all kinds of strange things. There was that TikTok is kind of the Fox News of the young, and it just spreads these memes and platforms and ideas that don't have a lot of reference to the world as it actually is, but that are much more effectively than Twitter calculated to play on the emotions of the user.
Yeah. And obviously, capitalists, well, it's funny to say that about a company owned by the Chinese Communist Party, but people who want to make money will and get clicks and keep you on their app, they will play that game. David, I guess one of the big fears is that at some point, though, that could also be a form of political propaganda where China could use their savvy ability to keep people hooked and keep people watching to influence political opinion or turn Americans even more against one another.
Yeah, I think the latter. I think that one of the things I think we can now say, having watched this go on for almost a decade with the Russians on Facebook and now the Chinese on TikTok, is affirmative propaganda doesn't do so well. The Russians are able. There's a tiny handful of pre-persuaded nutcases who will say, "I support the denazification of Ukraine." But that's just, those are fringe and highly ideological weirdos, and they were Stalinists before there was social media, and there still are Stalinists. The power of social media in the hands of an authoritarian, unfriendly nation is its ability to inflame and divide, and to spread, and to have something that is not quite as explicitly political. If I don't think it would go very far if China were to try to use Twitter to say Taiwan belongs to China.
Yeah.
But it will go far if China wants to say, seeing, for example, our collapsing life expectancy among young people. If you want to spread the idea, don't take shots. Chocolate-covered cashews can cure polio. Don't eat broccoli; it spreads inflammation. Those kinds of messages actually really do well, and that's, you can mess up your adversary as well by spreading these fantastic delusions as with an affirmative propaganda message.
It also strikes me, and this may be a middle-aged guy here who's never been on TikTok, who's paranoid, but the data the intel that they could be collecting, the CCP could be collecting. Let's say there's a young person today who becomes president in 30 years. Well, they're going to know what he's susceptible to,
Yeah.
or she.
Yeah.
And it could be as simple as there's a certain type of woman that you always, spend time watching when whatever it is. I mean, that it seems very dangerous to me to be giving this kind of information to our adversaries.
But one of my takeaways from the TikTok hearings, and David Rothkopf wrote a very good column about this at the Daily Beast, where you also publish, in which he said that it would be the message, do something about TikTok, is the wrong message. The message is we need to regulate these platforms in ways that protect privacy and prevent abuse. And whether the platform is owned in China or owned through shell companies on the way to China or owned by Americans or owned by global stock market investors, it's the behavior that you should and can regulate. I mean, I was struck that the day before the TikTok hearings, there was a big fundraiser here in DC sponsored by a bunch of people who invested in Facebook, attended by Kevin McCarthy, one of your filthy rich politicians, at which they raised.
By the way, David, since you invoked the book and Kevin McCarthy, he's not in the book a lot. But you know what's interesting? He made his money. He's a middle-class guy. Like, he grew up a middle-class family, like, I don't know, in Northern California or something. But he won $5,000 in the lottery. With that money, he opened up like a deli or a sandwich shop. And this is the lore, the legend. But that experience taught him the dangers of taxation and regulation. And that is what he was never into politics before. That's what got him involved in politics.
Didn't he also have a family farm that got a lot of special favors from the state government?
I think that was later.
Yeah.
But maybe the two things go hand in hand. Was it Modesto? Was it where's Merle Haggard and those country guys from? It's somewhere there. But anyway,
the point of this story about the fundraiser. So there they were the night before, or the night before the TikTok hearings, raising funds from people who are TikTok competitors who are saying, yes, TikTok is a menace to our American way of life. Put them out of business. And oh, by the way, don't regulate Facebook. But I mean, Facebook now seems lame and out of date. But but there will be new companies, and the capacity for abuse is there. So let's put down some rules of the road, and let's have some privacy standards and other regulatory safety and anti-abuse standards that seem objectively necessary.
Let me ask you about Ron DeSantis. So I wrote a piece this week at the Daily Beast where I was sort of laying out just anecdotally, it feels like, if you'd asked me a month or two ago, I was pretty bullish on Ron DeSantis. And part of that is that I felt like Donald Trump, his launch was bad. He'd had lunch with the white supremacist. He had a horrible midterm. And DeSantis he still has a lot of arguments in his favor. He's Trump without the baggage. DeSantis had just won, re-election by a large margin. But now that DeSantis has kind of started, he's still not officially running, but he started to roll out his campaign. He's doing like on a book tour. He's doing interviews. He just doesn't seem, there's a body language problem. There's a weirdness or an awkwardness that I'm picking up on. I mean, this is like anecdotal, but it feels like he either doesn't have it or he's lost his mojo. My sense is as long as he was in Florida and he could control the environment, and stand behind that podium and yell at reporters, he was in his milieu. He looked and sounded good. But now, like, I thought in the Pierce Morgan, is that his name? Certainly not Pierce Brosnan. Anyway, in the Pierce interview, I thought he did not come across well. What's your take?
Well, we have some pieces of evidence here. So there are two polls, Quinnipiac and Monmouth, that are both pretty solid independent polls that found about a 12-point slide in his support between the middle of February and the middle of March. So the DeSantis allies countered that by releasing to Axios a poll that they did, not the DeSantis campaign, but these allies of DeSantis, that showed him if you asked people, gave them only the two names, DeSantis and Trump, and showed it in Iowa, New Hampshire, that DeSantis had a slight lead in those two early states. But when you read the full poll, what you saw was, wait a moment, what also happened here was when you introduced other names, the DeSantis advantage disappeared. In other words, the Trump, even in the DeSantis friendly poll, the Trump block was solid. And the DeSantis block was an anti-Trump block that could go anywhere. So I think what DeSantis has done a good job of capitalizing on unease with Trump among the more affluent and more educated people still in the Republican Party. But he has not, there's no affirmative case for him. And for some of the reasons that you mentioned, people say in Florida, there are two kinds of people in America, those who believe that Ron DeSantis is a credible candidate for president, and those who have met Ron DeSantis. And so that's funny, but very few of us ever will meet Ron DeSantis. But, he's not a personable man. He's not an attractive person. And he's also, it turns out, although we're told he's very intelligent, he's not quick on his feet, and he can't solve, never mind on his feet. On the Ukraine problem, he couldn't solve that he tried to walk between the raindrops on that and appease both the highly noisy and visible anti-Ukraine bloc and the majority of Republican voters who are pro-Ukraine. And instead, he ended up offending and alienating both sides rather than appeasing both sides. There's a kind of clumsiness to his operation. And the last thing is, most of what he has to say to people outside Florida is just, unless you're spending 6 hours a day on Fox and message boards, it's unintelligible. I mean, he denounced what's the acronym for central bank digital currency? And I follow currency stuff reasonably closely, and I still can't remember whether it's CBGB or CBDC or what. And then then there's his ESG and CRT and DEI and there's this sea of acronyms that, and I just feel like, as someone who has not seen a Star Wars movie since the early 1980s, I just feel like I'm in a world of fan fiction with people who are talking about things I don't understand.
And you do this for a living, right? I mean, it's hard to keep up.
A lot of other people behind too.
Speaking of movies, I'm reminded there's a scene in Ocean's 11, the more modern, the Clooney version, where Clooney and Brad Pitt meet with their benefactor to talk about this, burglary or whatever, the caper that they're going to be involved in. And the benefactor says, if you try this with Terry Benedict's casino, you better make sure that he doesn't know who did it, because he's going to murder you. He's going to kill you. He's going to bankrupt you, and then he'll really get to work on you, And I have to get the exact quote, but it reminds me of Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump is vicious at the way he goes after people, and you could be used to facing tough hombres in politics, but Trump takes it to another level.
Right, and it's not just that he's meaner than other people, but he has a strategic advantage, and he's a psychological shrewdness. Here's something he just did to Ron DeSantis. One of Ron DeSantis's big legislative priorities was getting through a bill that basically made it more difficult to get money out of your insurance company. Big issue in Florida because they allow they subsidize people to live on beaches. There's a lot of hurricane damage. The homeowners don't pay the real cost of their insurance, and the insurance companies are getting grumbly that they have to do these payouts when they're not getting real premiums. And the state government is supposed to give them these homeowners on the beach a subsidy, but it's not sufficient, and so there's tension about the insurance industry. So he passed a big bill to bail out the insurance company, a major priority of his. Donald Trump turned on him about this, because Donald Trump it's not just that he's vicious, it's that because he has a purely personal following, He doesn't need ever to be consistent, and he doesn't have real world concerns. I mean, their insurance in Ron DeSantis is beholden to the insurance industry. They gave him money. He does what they want, and if he doesn't do what they want, they will stop supporting him. Unlike Trump people who don't care. So he has to follow through, even if it polls badly, because that's what his donors want, and he's a creature of the donors. So Trump turned on him, and the result was that DeSantis, he still signed the bill, but he banned all media and all photographers. And that's that. Donald Trump keeps showing this ascendancy over DeSantis because DeSantis basically is subordinate to the big, deep-pocketed Republican Party, and Trump is superior.
Yeah.
And that gives him a repeated strategic advantage that he is willing to use because he has no convictions, no principles, and no donors that he needs to worry about.
I think that's totally right. Hard to fight a guy like that. Something you said that underscores my earlier point. You said that DeSantis banned reporters, media from this event. I think that's how he operates in Florida. He's able to control his environment, and if he doesn't want to talk to the press, he bans them.
Yes.
As a result, though, what happens is it's a form of protectionism.
Yeah.
If you are never facing a hostile audience, then you're not training yourself to have to think on your feet or to have to respond to tough questions or to take stands. You're postponing all of that. And so I'm thinking that like DeSantis hasn't gone through the preparation that a governor might normally go through before he is thrust into the spotlight. I mean, especially a governor from Florida, you would think would have been through the ringer by the time he runs for president.
You'd think. But yeah, he does seem like someone who, as you said, has built this favorable environment. Look, and as governor, he did something. He took some risks that paid off for him. I mean, one of his big decisions was to reopen the schools in August of 2020. And whatever the reason he did it, whether it was anti-vax ideology or whatever the reason, it was a call. Other people made opposite calls. And it looks like, from the point of view of the learning chances, the life chances of a generation of Florida children, it looks like a good call. And so that bought him a lot. I think that's the reason why he did so well in the 2022 election. There was a lot of goodwill in Florida because he kept the schools open when other states were closing. But instead of building on that, of being, hey, I'm Mr. School, that he's Mr. incomprehensible acronym for the highly online Fox News audience. And because he's waging this kind of ultra insidery primary for some of the strangest, for the support of Cat Turd 2, that he's drifted away from the kinds of things that make you a successful politician. And meanwhile, Joe Biden is tweeting, "I'm off to Las Vegas today to talk about $35 a shot insulin." That's not, and the people who use insulin, they know what they're paying for it, and they know they're paying less.
Well, while we're down in Florida talking, I have to ask you about this, story where there was a teacher from I think it was a classical Christian school in Florida. He's a principal or a teacher or something who I guess was let go because he showed I think it was sixth grade students, the David, the Michelangelo statue, which you would think that people interested in classical education would be pretty cool with. What's your take on, because it strikes me that this story, I don't want to blame Ron DeSantis, but it does strike me that this is a microcosm of something larger.
But it's also about 48 hours after that story came the story that the Agatha Christie estate was rewriting the contents of Agatha Christie novels to bring them more in line with certain contemporary sensibilities. This follows the Roald Dahl estate doing something very similar, and before that, the Ian Fleming estate doing a similar thing. And so I wrote something about why this was unwise. And I got a lot of pushback from people who, I don't know this, but I bet they were among the people who mocked the decision on the David. So I guess my question is, if you think it was wrong to fire the principal for showing students a picture of the David, how are you on James and the Giant Peach? and and uh, I think if you're going to be grown up about art and literature, you have to be consistently grown up about art and literature, and that means it's art and literature. I mean, it's full of stuff that like people who don't care about art and literature think it's all improving, think it's all somber music and uncomfortable chairs in concert halls, and that it never present. And in fact, the thing that makes great art great is it's full of wild and wacky things, all kinds of, and that's one of the reasons it offers emancipation to people, is it's full of these crazy ideas, and many of them, by the way, very undesirable and uncomfortable ideas that I, Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice, this classic of the Black liberation movement, includes a chapter celebrating rape. Thomas Mann, the ultimate highbrow German improving writer. What is Death? His most famous novella, Death in Venice. It's all about sexual attraction to young boys. People write about there are great stories that are full of blood. I mean, the Iliad is full of bloodlust. Don't get me started on the Bible, which people quote, but they don't actually think about. Wait a minute.
Yeah.
The Israelites.
There's a story in the Old Testament where somebody rapes a girl, and I think she's like a Jewish girl.
Dinah.
You probably know the story better than I do, right? So to get revenge, like her family, her brothers find the guy who did it and say, like, we're not going to hurt you. But you need to get married to her.
Yes.
And join, and we would like you all, your tribe, to get circumcised, right? To join us. So all the men in this other nation or tribe become circumcised. And so while they're circumcised, they can't fight back for a few days. And then the family of the girl who was raped completely slaughters and kills every man like in the other tribe. You probably know the story better than me, but that is a wild story that I have never heard preached. I've sat through a lot of evangelical services, and I've never heard that ever brought up by any preacher.
Well, this is why people, or the story that a few lines away from that, a daughter-in-law prostitutes herself to her father-in-law. Look, the reason I think a lot of the more proper forms of religion in the United States, like the King James Bible, is it because it puts up a veil of incomprehensibility between you and what is actually going on, and more plain language texts can be potentially shocking. But the point is, I don't mean to single out the Bible. The Quran is full of blood-curdling things too. Books are strange places. Art is shocking when done right. So it's not wrong that you're shocked, but it's wrong that you think that you can both escape and still be a thinking person. And I did this in the same thread where I was talking about the cleaning up of Agatha Christie. I just imagine what does a good review from one of these sensitivity readers look like? This book was predictable, moralistic, and dull. It contained no idea unfamiliar to me before. It aroused no strong emotion in me. Highly recommended, 5 stars. Like, have you ever, if you've never had a strongly negative reaction to a book, you've probably never had a strongly positive reaction to one either.
I do think, though, that there are things that would be inappropriate to take your 6th grade Christian school to see, like a Mapplethorpe exhibit might be something that is inappropriate. But the David, yeah. I would not classify as being, pornography or problematic in any way for really any age, in my opinion.
So, yes, but a word in defense of Mapplethorpe. So Mapplethorpe became famous for his photographs of flowers. And that he did high close-ups of flowers, and there was definitely a kind of phallic element to some of these close-ups, but you had to sort of be looking for it to know that it was there. But otherwise, I believe the thing that made him notorious was a show that was done after his death, where it turned out he had also had a private collection of more homoerotic photographs that he kept for himself. that had never been displayed. And a museum for grown-ups said, you know that guy who took all those amazing photographs of flowers? Here's something else he did. Well, I don't know that I take a 6-year-old to see it, but do I? But remember, the complaint at the time was the museum shouldn't have shown it, and public money shouldn't have gone to the museum. And you think, you know what? We're grown-ups. We can handle it. And it's important to, and the real obscenity here is that the only thing most people now know about Robert Mapplethorpe is this one show of stuff he never intended for the broader public to see, and that the things he did intend for you to see, they're known to specialists and not the broader public.
It's always more complex and interesting than the shorthand. All right, so we're heading into the fourth quarter of our conversation, and I'm out of segues, but I got three things I want to talk to you about before I let you go. One, this kind of mini bank crisis that seemed like a really big deal for about a week, and seems to have kind of gone away. I don't know if that means we hyperventilated for no reason, or if it means that Joe Biden actually did a very good job of stopping this from spreading.
Well, I don't think Joe Biden did very much one way or the other. What Joe Biden's job was to hire good secretaries of the Treasury and then get into the job good heads of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and for them to make sure that they have teams of properly paid, highly competent professionals. There's something like the banks go bust all the time in the United States. And this bank, this Silicon Valley Bank, was an especially odd bank and had very large accounts, individual accounts with hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars in cash in them. And so that created all kinds of special problems. And it had lobbied to be exempted from regulation on the grounds that it was too small, that just as some things are too big to fail, it argued it was too small to fail. And so there are some specialized problems, but the FDIC system worked. And it's just when
the FDIC system would have insured anything, $250,000 and under.
Yeah, but the real way they usually work, because you don't want to protect only those smaller accounts, is that they have sort of informal conversations with other banks. And because it typically banks are facing not a solvency problem, which is that their portfolio isn't worth enough to cover their obligations, but that it's a liquidity problem. They don't have cash on hand. And so you can say to somebody, usually, if you buy this bank now, you're going to get a bunch of, and if you've got the cash where you can hold on, these assets will recover and you're not going to lose any money. And then we'll owe you a favor for if you ever get in trouble. And definitely, I don't see the case for having a limit on deposits. I mean, the federal government should insure, it seems to me, all deposits, but it should also charge a premium. That's what the regulatory battle in the Trump administration was, that the Trump administration approved a deal, and it was a small story at the time. We all should have paid more attention to it, where in effect they capped the premiums while maintaining and saying we're ending the liabilities, but in fact the liabilities are infinite. So the premium should be adjusted accordingly. But the fact is, we got through it, and we discovered that and every time over these nervous months since COVID, we're discovering the strength and resilience of the American economy. And I just keep thinking, when I hear people talk about China threat and so on, I think of this scene from Mad Men, where one of the partners in the advertising firm they're talking about a young man who comes from a very fancy but no longer so wealthy family. And the partner in the advertising firm is explaining, well, the family was prominent because once upon a time they owned all of Manhattan above 138th Street. But during the Depression, they panicked and sold at a loss. And then he said ruefully, I just don't understand people who don't have confidence in this country. And I sort of like the American economy, the motor of it is so amazing and creative and dynamic. So there are these nervous moments, and we all pay a lot of taxes to employ people with the expertise to get us through them. And they did their job. So thank you.
You've been talking about how interest rates and the raising of interest rates is sort of underrated in terms of the effect that it's having on businesses and even our political system. And it seems like the raising of interest rates was behind what happened at Silicon Valley Bank.
My late father, who had a long and very storied business career, in his last decade, sat on a number of corporate boards, and he used to joke he had one job on the board, which is to say to CEOs in their 40s, "What will happen to this idea if interest rates go up 3 points?" And they would look at him like Methuselah. Interest rates don't go up. Interest rates go down. No one in this company has ever seen interest rates go up. What are you talking about? It's been all downhill since 2001, down, 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 down. And yeah, they sometimes go up, and people find that hard to believe. And look, we have lived through a period where, from the 90s, the 2000s, the 10s, where interest rates started low and went lower, and where labor was relatively abundant. And we are moving into a period in the 2020s when interest rates are going to be higher and when labor is going to be chronically scarce. And so, and while there will be while there'll be fluctuations in the weather, that's the economic climate that we're all going to be facing. Higher, more expensive money and more scarce labor, and everything else is going to have to adjust. And when you say it's on, I think that fact that has driven people in Silicon Valley mental. That's why people like Elon Musk and his circle seem genuinely crazier than they were in 2018, because they've built whole business careers on the theory that they're geniuses. But the real thing that drove their careers was money was free. And a lot of their ideas, which are not necessarily bad ideas, but they flunked the test that my dad used to set. Well, what if interest rates go up 3 points? If interest rates go up 3 points and you've paid $44 billion for Twitter, a company with tens of millions of dollars in revenue, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And because no one took that possibility as seriously as my dad would have advised them to do, a lot of people whose whole self-concept is bound up not just in being rich — there are a lot of rich people in America — but in being smarter than everybody else, now look dumber than everybody else, and it's making them nuts.
Well, since you were talking about labor and being in high demand, I'm concerned about you and I staying in high demand. Uh, now I'm like ready to get the pitchfork and the lantern and go after automation and AI and Chat GPT. How concerned are you that the technology is getting to a point in which we will no longer have gainful employment as
Um,
writers?
uh, this has been a fear with every degree of technological improvement since the invention of the steam engine. And maybe someday it'll be true, but my own sense is that what machines do is relieve people of drudgery, but it does change the relative value of factors of production. And look, we've lived through, speaking of changes, we've lived through a period when people who earn their living by symbolic manipulation, writers, accountants, all that, even if our wages haven't gone up, our purchasing power has been enormously increased by the downward pressure on people who perform manual physical services. Um, you know, the DoorDash experience. You can have a beautiful meal delivered to your home for a lot less than it would have cost to have the same experience 30 years ago. And that's been driven by all kinds of efficiencies have been applied to people who do in-person physical services. Well, I think we're now going to go through a big rebalancing where, because of labor shortages, the people who do those kinds of in-person services, whether low-tech, high-tech, blue-collar, of all kinds, those are going to become more expensive. And those of us who engage in symbolic manipulation are going to find that we're less well off, including, by the way, people who do financial engineering, because with the age of free money over, a lot of deals that would have happened in 2018 are not going to be happening in 2023 and 2024. But I really am highly skeptical of this idea that machines that do routine services are going to be able to replace the non-routine. We're all going to be driven to do non-routine. I mean, what AI can do, and I've suspected for a lot of time that a lot of the content on social media written by people with names and addresses, it might as well be written by AI because it's so predictable. Um, But the machine can only predict, what the machine is doing is predicting, and it can predict the predictable. And if you just make it, my job is actually to think in a more systematic way and deliver more value, then that's going to be needed. And we're all being driven toward a world of ever intense specialization, to ever greater refinement of what we do, to improvement. And so my own suspicion is that that a lot. It's not that I think this is all ballyhooed, but I think a lot of it is misplaced, and some of it is complaining from people who are about to experience, for sort of symbolic manipulation in America, what was done to physical manipulation in America between 1990 and the COVID pandemic.
So, but just to pin you down, I get the part about how we're going to be paying more for goods and services, but in terms of there still being a demand for, let's be honest, the most important thing here: will I have a job in 5 or 10 years? Uh, where are
You
you?
you will
How,
have a
how,
job
how
to the extent that you are doing what is unpredictable. You will have a job. To the extent that you are doing what is predictable, that's going to be displaced. And um, and I think, for example, that people who I imagine that a lot of technical writing can be done by machine. I mean, it used to be that when I graduated from law school, young lawyers would make very high incomes, spending their first few years basically as proofreaders. They would go through a corporate an SEC document and read it line by line painstakingly and make the then huge sum of whatever it was they made. Um, and they don't do that anymore because now the machines can do the proofreading, and no one's going to pay a first year associate salary to proofread. But that doesn't mean there aren't first year associates. And in the same way, I mean, I think a lot of the people who are in the hot take business are going to find, that TikTok meme can be done by an artificial intelligence. But if you're going to say something surprising and unexpected, if you're going to do some research, the AI is not going to pick up a phone and do interviews.
yet? All right, you made me feel a little better. Let's end it. I want to talk about you have been, you've traveled to Mexico, you've written about Mexico, and you believe that something that's going on in Mexico is going to be a big deal that we better pay attention to. Tell us about this story.
So I'll recommend, the long form is in an article I wrote for The Atlantic called "The Autocrat Next Door." But basically, what we're seeing in Mexico is a supposedly left-wing president is trying to consolidate power in a way that is similar to what you see in Hungary, in India. I'm sorry to say, in Israel. And he's met some resistance, but on balance, he looks like he is going to be more or less successful. And Mexico has been on retreat. Mexico turned toward multi-party democracy in the 1990s, and it's in retreat. Why should Americans care about that? And the answer to that is because as the Mexican state has been consolidating power at the center, it's also been losing control over the country. And there are big parts of Mexico which are effectively run by criminal organizations. And they're not just narcos anymore. They do people smuggling, they steal natural resources, they are often almost substitute governments, taxing local businesses and providing a criminal version of protection and contract enforcement. We could see a real crisis of authority of the Mexican state in the parts of Mexico that are on the US border happening around the time of the next presidential election in Mexico, which is the summer of 2024. Mexico has been a subject that Americans prefer not to deal with. Donald Trump had, weirdly, the supposedly left-wing president had a great relationship with Donald Trump because he struck a deal. Trump said to him, I need two things. I need you to suppress immigration flows, and I need you to be more protectionist toward Chinese cars under NAFTA. And if you do that, and the president of Mexico said, fine, then I don't care if you destroy Mexican democracy. Biden's had a somewhat longer agenda, but he still has not been it's not been one of his top priorities. And so the result is we're going to have a crippled Mexican state on the American border as these criminal organizations get stronger. And there is a potential for I mean, we already have, in a country that is 1/3 of the population of the United States, approximately, something like 35,000 homicides a year. America, three
Yeah.
times the size of Mexico, is about 20,000 homicides.
We just had a story a couple weeks ago, right, where people were abducted,
Yeah.
right on the border in the Texas border, and I think at least one of them was killed.
Two were murdered. Well, that's an example of what is going on. So one of the rules of the Mexican gang industry is don't kill Americans. because that's just mess. That's bad for business. That's messy. But these 4 people who are African American crossed the border in a minivan, having driven there from South Carolina. I hope it's not injurious to the memory of the 2 who are deceased to say it looked like they were there for improper purposes. But more important, they were mistaken. They're Black Americans. They were mistaken for one of the Haitian gangs that operates in that part of Mexico, and that's why they were kidnapped. And that's why 2 of them were killed. And I think that somewhere between the second killing and the third person, the kidnappers realized they're not Haitians, they're Americans. Uh-oh.
Yeah, because didn't the cartel like apologize or
Yeah.
something?
Cartels will do that. If they do, think of the cartels as they're almost like quasi governments. So if they overstep what they think the local population will bear, they do these symbolic things, and they will deliver up. And in this case, they delivered up a bunch of supposed gunmen. Now, remember, only about 5% of homicide cases in Mexico are ever prosecuted all the way to the end. So it's not like these people are actually going to go to prison, but there's going to be a symbolic atonement, something that they can symbolically say to the American government: we submit to you. We are not contesting your authority. Please don't send the DEA here with thousands of police. But there's a contest here where the gangs are almost as strong as the Mexican government. Everyone understands the United States government is much more powerful than either, so do not invite the Americans to participate. But the United States wants not just Americans not to be kidnapped and murdered, it wants real security on the U.S. border. And that is something that is going to become more and more of a question mark as Mexican democracy weakens and as the illegitimacy of the Mexican state. The cartels have almost as many guns as the Mexican state. But the Mexican state has legitimacy, and if it loses that, it loses one of its most important assets.
Always learn a lot talking with you. It's always a pleasure. David, any final thoughts or anything you want to plug before we let you go?
I'm about to lose my Twitter verification. I now am talking. You're not, and I'm going to be out of the For You column. So I don't pay blackmail. So I'm not going to be paying the $8. But if you enjoy the content I give on Twitter, you'll need to follow it, and you may want to. On my feed, I give instructions on how you can set up your browser so that you see what you want and not the paid content that will be provided to you by Twitter after the 1st of April.
I love it, because I'm probably going to lose. I assume I'm losing my verification the same day, the same minute you do. So please do that. Get Trumpocalypse. Follow him at David Frum on Twitter while you can. And pre-order Filthy Rich Politicians, my forthcoming book. David Frum, thank you for coming back on the news.
Pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.